Hey, what's up everyone? I wanted to come on tonight and talk about three main objections to the Ordinariate, the Anglican Ordinariate. For those of you who may not know what the Ordinariate is, so it's a group of Catholics who in 2009, due to a motu proprio by Pope Benedict XVI, allowed large numbers of traditional Anglicans normally, convert to Catholicism while also retaining their Anglican patrimony. So I have a number of videos, Catholic in a Car number 14, called Anglican or Catholic, talks more on the subject, as well as an interview that I did with Father John Hodgins, where it's called This Holy Faith, Father John Hodgins, and you can see a link to it up in the card. Father John is a priest of the Anglican Ordinariate, or the Ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter, as it's actually called. And what the structure allows is traditional Anglicans, it gave them a means to convert to Catholicism while retaining their Anglican liturgy and retaining some of the devotions and prayers. And they actually, so they're a separate structure. They're not, it's almost like a personal prelature. They are not under the authority of the local Catholic bishop. So they have basically a superior general in the three different territories of the Ordinariate where they are controlled from. So of course, in many cases, as in the case with Father John Hodgins up here in Toronto, they do work with the local bishop oftentimes, but strictly speaking, they're not required to do so because they are part of this Ordinariate structure. But getting into the three main objections that I hear to this Ordinariate, and I hear this from a number of Catholics, and that's the reason I wanted to come on and talk about it. The first main objection that I often hear is that since Anglicans, during the schism in the 16th century with King Henry VIII, who created the Anglican Church, so to speak, he didn't really create the Anglican Church, but the English Church was, part of the greater Catholic Church until Henry VIII caused a schism. And for many years they had valid orders and they had, a valid liturgy and whatnot. And, under the Edward Ordinal, that's when things went awry for the Anglicans. But the number one objection that I often hear is, since they left the Roman Rite, shouldn't they therefore have to come back and convert through the Roman Rite? And oftentimes this happens. So most often, if you've ever met an Anglican who became a Catholic, that's normally the way that they convert, because of the fact that this motu proprio, Anglicanorum Coevitas, is not really that old. It's only about 8 years old, or maybe 9 years old at this point. So therefore, most Anglicans you've ever met, they usually converted through that way. They went through RCIA, and they converted as any other Protestant convert would, which is perfectly legitimate. But what the structure did is it provided a means that people with, an attachment to this Anglican heritage or this Anglican patrimony were able to come in, and everything that they retained that was good from their Anglican patrimony, they were able to hold on to and able to keep. Everything that was not in accord with the Catholic faith, or maybe even heretical, was discarded. And the Pope Benedict XVI worked very hard to make that happen. So I think it's a good thing for the church because it enriches the life of the church. And at this time that we see tradition under attack by many different dioceses and by many bishops and clergy all over the world, I think that an extra shot in the arm for tradition can't really be a bad thing. And as Father John Hodgins pointed out in the interview that I did with him, which you can link to up in the card, you'll see that, in fact, many parts of this Anglican use liturgy, as I call it, many parts of this ancient Mass is actually, it predates, it goes back, in some cases, over 1,000 years. When you look at the history of the Ceramuse Mass, for example, the Anglican Ordinariate's liturgy is, in many cases, or in most of it, it is actually just the Ceramuse, but with some changes to it, obviously. Now, the second objection I often hear, and this is at a more practical level, there's not too many people out there that are saying that this is heretical, but is married clergy confusing the faithful. So not everybody in the Ordinariate is married. That should be remembered, that not all the priests are necessarily married. There's celibate men as well. But on a case-by-case basis, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, I believe it is, or maybe it's the Pope directly, can decide to allow somebody that was an Anglican, quote, priest become a Catholic priest, and even if he's married. So it's decided on a case-by-case basis, whereas canon law actually governs the Eastern Catholic churches. So in that case, you know, in those two cases, even though they're very similar in the Eastern Catholic churches, we have married clergy, there's a little bit different of a method of how that's achieved. So it's decided on a case-by-case basis. Now, I can understand the objection that people can not quite understand. I mean, if you're not well-formed in your faith, you may be under the impression, or if your only exposure to Catholicism has only ever been the Roman Rite, then it may appear a bit confusing. I can understand that objection. But I think when you balance it out, when you examine the opportunity cost to it, I think that the negatives outweigh the positives outweigh the negatives. I think there's more positive by having these oftentimes very faithful priests, and some of these Anglican Ordinariate priests that convert to Catholicism. They're some of the best priests that I've ever met. If you want a good traditional priest with good sound advice, with great balance, in all the cases that I've met so far, and maybe you've had a different experience, but they're exceptional, holy, devout Catholic priests. So I think that the good outweighs the bad there. For the little bit of confusion maybe that it does cause for people that are not well informed, or you know, maybe have never really had exposure to, let's say, Eastern Rite Catholicism, I still think that it's a good thing at the end of the day. Now, the third objection that I hear, and this is a lesser objection because it's really only a number of traditionalists that will ever make this case, but for the sake of argument, I'm going to assume that they're correct, even though I'm not even necessarily saying that I subscribe to their position. But for the sake of argument, let's say that they're correct. And that is the papal bull, Quo Primum, which forbids, after its promulgation, the advancement of any other Mass in the Western Rite that is not the Tridentine Mass. So most Catholics obviously don't even know about this objection, or will never even make this claim. Even a large number of traditionalists do not interpret Quo Primum in this manner, but there's very many that do. So, and it's an objection that I hear quite often, is that, well, since Quo Primum was promulgated, the Pope actually has no right, at least under the Western Rite, to issue or to promulgate any other Mass. And my objection to it is this, is if you watch the interview with Father Hodgins, who is very informed on the faith, as he makes the case that even if that objection were true, the Anglican use liturgy is basically the Sarum Rite. So many elements of this Anglican use liturgy, the closest thing you're going to get to the Sarum Rite these days is this Anglican Ordinariate liturgy. So if you want to go on that, then while there was an existing tradition at least 200 or more years before, Quo Primum was even never promulgated. So therefore that objection is not entirely accurate if you want to make that case. So those are three of the main objections. Now I know there's many others that people bring up as well. There's often, you know, various nuances that people will claim should prevent this Anglican Ordinariate structure. But I think those are the three main ones that I've heard, and I've been hearing obviously a lot more in detail some of these arguments since I got into this work of Catholic media. But those are the three main ones that I hear, and I hear them very commonly. That being said, you're going to find some very devout Catholics at this Ordinariate parish, at least the one that I've been to. And I've actually been to a number of them. I've been to, I believe, 3 altogether. And you'll find some very great clergy. You'll find some very devout Catholics. Oftentimes they're keeping intact many of the traditions that in the Novus Ordo, in the Roman Rite, we have lost or have simply forgotten about or discarded. And they're keeping that intact. So even though the Mass is obviously not in Latin, they definitely have they're definitely affirming tradition in the positive sense. Many of the Western traditions that we simply discarded at the Second Vatican Council and afterwards. So I think that can only be a good thing for the Church. I mean, oftentimes we have this vision as traditionalists. Now, I don't go to the Ordinariate parishes often. I go sometimes as a visitor just for fun. But in any case, the parishes that I do go to, we often have this vision that, well, the Mass has to be in Latin. That's the only way that we're going to save the Church, is by returning to this Tridentine Mass. But what we often forget is it's not actually about the language. The language is not even really the most important thing, although it can be quite important, because with modern languages, obviously there's room for misinterpretation, and the meaning of words can change over time. But that's not really an objection, a proper objection, in the case of the Ordinariate, because the language that they use is very Old English that, oftentimes in everyday use, has fallen out of practice. So the integrity of the liturgy is preserved just in the fact that the English that they use is often, at this point you could almost say, an ancient English, although you're probably familiar with the words. It's not like you're reading English from 1,000 years ago, which sounded very German or Norse or whatever. There's many influences on the English language, obviously, but in any case, I'm very happy with the Ordinariate, and I've met a very good number of people there. So let me know what you think of some of the things that I said in the comments below, and that's all for now.